Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Wednesday evening session of the Hess Scholar in Residence program. My name is Lauren Mancia, and I'm a professor in the History Department at Brooklyn College and the Wolf Faculty Associate this academic year. And welcome to the secret history of academic disciplines. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Brooklyn College is a college that sits on the traditional and unceded territory stolen from the Canarsie and the Nyack, subgroups of the Lenape people. And that ongoing theft, along with the stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans, enables our presence today. Today, we're going to talk about why it is significant that many of the disciplines and departments of our modern university were formed and developed in the 18th and 19th centuries at the same time that European countries were colonizing various parts of the world, or in the 20th century at the same time that the world was attempting to decolonize. Our panelists today will discuss how colonialism shaped various academic disciplines and how scholars today are attempting to fundamentally decolonize and transform age-old concepts and categories that have historically been foundational to their disciplinary methodologies. Each speaker will speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and then after they speak, we'll open the floor for questions, comments, and conversation until we end at 6:20, not 8:20, 6:20 p.m. So we're going to begin with Professor Yana Kuchirko, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Brooklyn College. So Yana, take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Just going to, everyone can see my screen. Okay, wonderful. So today I'll be talking about a few problems of psychology. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that all of my work takes place in community with my colleagues and students at CUNY and beyond, with whom I grow, with whom I learn, with whom I unlearn. And so what I say here today reflects the collective effort to reimagine and reconstruct how psychology is done within my discipline. And so historically, psychologists have contributed a great deal to the colonial project. Many of us are familiar with the role that psychologists played in the eugenics movement with the use of seemingly objective intelligence testing. Psychologists reinforced the social order, there's crazy stuff going outside, that underscored white supremacy. And such classification systems emerged from and in support of European colonialism, oppression, and discrimination. And so white people were deemed more fit. Anyone who did not fit this mold of racial perfection became a target of horrific eugenics programs. And interestingly, 31 out of 56 presidents of the American Psychological Association between 1892 and 1947 were affiliated with or leaders in the eugenics movements. And so these ideas are still around today, cloaked in perhaps less obvious clothing, but there are also many, many other ways that psychology continues to be steeped in colonialism, and I'll just name a handful because I have 8 minutes. So first, much, not all, but much of the discipline is deeply rooted in naive empiricism. And so this perspective assumes an objective vantage point of phenomena, when in fact that vantage point can be situated and traced back to specific terrain of Western-centric scholarship. And so these implicit assumptions of objectivity, or like the world exists outside of your perspectives of it, studies can be conducted to minimize bias, positionality of the researcher holds no bearing or very little bearing on the research process. Science is neutral, it's not political, it's acontextual. Data speak for themselves. And similar to Eduardo Bonilla Silva's notion of racism without racists, a book about colorblind discourse upholding racial structures, here I borrow Jose Cosadius's brilliant term of science without scientists. There are clearly psychologists who do the work, but yet many will underestimate their influence on the research process. And so in essence, we have a positionality blind discourse upholding positivism. And so for many, positivist value neutral social science is an imperial project. It's a methodological objectivity that enables the constitution of universally valid truths across space, across time. Second, who has the power to produce knowledge and where continues to be in the hands of white, mostly Western countries. The graph on the left shows a percentage of psychologists in academia by ethnic racial background, and we see that close to 80% of them are white. This is true for psychology more broadly. Most editorial members of top journals are also white, and most journals come from Western countries. So you see the graph on the right pooled all the journals associated, I think close to 3,000 of them associated with American Psychological Association. And we see that they're mostly housed in North America and Europe. And so who is studied, how their behaviors are interpreted, and whose experience is generalized to humanity also all points to the white experience. So most participants in psychology are white, and participants come from what are called weird contexts: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. There are problems with this acronym. It's been critiqued many times, but it's very useful in that these samples represent 80% of participants in psychology, but only 12% of the world's population. And there's something even more pernicious than this going on. And that points to the interpretation of findings when data are collected. And so not only are participants weird and white, but they're also deemed raceless and culturalist and generalizable to all of human experience. So most research articles published in top journals of psychology and across cognitive psych, developmental, social psych fail to consider how race plays a role in human behavior and fail to actually embed their findings in racialized contexts, so perpetuating the raceless human. When psychologists do study phenomena that they deem as universal, they oversample white people, and then they overemphasize the individual characteristics in shaping human behavior. In contrast, when they study phenomena that are culturally embedded, they oversample ethnic racial minorities, and culture becomes a driving force shaping human behavior. Moreover, when studies are conducted with BIPOC communities in Western contexts, in the global South, psychologists frequently confound ethnicity and race with deficit-oriented topics like poverty, drug use, sexuality, reinforcing notions of white supremacy. Moreover, because there's a running list of this, when psychologists oversample white participants, and especially American participants, they are more likely to generalize the findings of the study to humanity, right? So the white American stands in for what humans do. And finally, men, particularly white men, outnumber women and psychologists of color exponentially when it comes to being cited in textbooks. And I gather this holds up in citations of journal articles as well. And so collectively, these findings reinforce this racial social order, right? The result is that in American psychology and much of Western psychology, the identities, the values, the lived experiences of marginalized communities are silenced, ignored, subjugated, or distorted through the application of Euro-American knowledge, theories, and methods. And even the rat is white. Fantastic book if you're interested. Another fun fact that I found out that many rats that are used in studies are actually male, because the female rats are deemed too variable and adds to the noise of the data. And it's been contested and challenged, but this holds up in not just human experience. And finally, psychology contributes to the subjugation of knowledges and experiences of BIPOC communities by limiting the type of methods deemed valuable and valid in research. So in psychology, quantitative methods rule. They are seen as more legitimate, they're more rigorous, they're the gold standard, particularly experimental methods. They're almost exclusively taught at undergraduate levels and graduate. And although they're fantastic, I happen to use many of them myself. I think they're excellent approaches to science, but the problem is they limit the types of questions that can be asked. And when science suffers when research methods and not research questions drive inquiry. And the types of questions in psychology that center their experiences and epistemologies of marginalized communities are precisely those that require qualitative methods, open-ended methodologies that immerse researchers in the communities they're studying, that require an analysis of power dynamics between the researcher and the researched, continuous reflexivity at all stages of the research process, and methods like participatory action research that bring the community along with the researcher to co-construct the knowledge together. And so the constructivist and interpretivist and deeply contextual and cultural foundations of qualitative work challenge the positivist neutral, apolitical, value-free assumptions behind dominant methods in psychology. And so if psychology is about capturing a range of human experience, it has a lot of structural work to do. And with that, I will end and say thank you so much. I hope I was within my allotted time slot.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Our next speaker is Professor Lisa Lowe, who is the Hess Scholar in Residence and Samuel Knight Professor of American Studies at Yale University. Professor Lowe.
Thank you. That was a brilliant paper. I learned a lot. And there'll be some resonance with what I'm discussing today. The mid-20th century US university was profoundly tied to the strategic, political, and economic interests of the US state as the US ascended to global power after World War II. In the report of the Gulbenkian Commission on the Restructuring of the Social Sciences, they observed that after 1945, in response to both the global economic power of the post-war United States and the decolonization movements and historical reassertion of non-European peoples, the nature of academic disciplines established in the previous century changed dramatically. The post-war period saw the establishment of area studies that provided training in the areas in which the US had a strategic political interest. East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, African, Latin American, and Middle Eastern area studies, for example, were aided by support from the US government, which funded the foreign language and area studies programs, whose fellowships and grants created specialists in the language, history, and cultures of China, Japan, India, Russia, the Philippines, and other areas of crucial interest to the US State Department, to national security, and to foreign policy. In addition, between 1945 and 1970, there was a scalar expansion of productive capacity and population in nearly all spheres of human activity, including the geographic expansion of the university system, leading to a multiplication, even if unevenly manifested, across the world. Changes to the American university in the post-war and Cold War period prepared the United States for globalization, establishing programs for Americans to become experts in the languages, cultures, and societies of those peoples in which the US, peoples and countries in which the US would become a ruling power, and supporting the expansion of university systems globally. This period also saw the growth of modernization studies, which adapted the ideas of Max Weber to presume Western-styled industrial development and state forms as the ideal type for the development of formerly colonized societies emerging into new nationhood. And it required their assimilation to these norms as a condition for their integration into the world system. Modernization approaches and area studies, in effect, judge other societies and created a global hierarchy of societies in which formerly colonized societies in the global South were considered non-modern and less modern, or latecomers to modernity. These are the very terms used by mid-century sociologists like Talcott Parsons and Marion Levy. And their externality to modernity was articulated as a racial difference. And this is the resonance with Professor Kuchirko's discussion of psychology's normative subject. Denise De Silva observes, quote, "The racial was articulated as a category distinguishing modern technological and cultural conditions from those which are spatially adjacent to, but temporally distant from modernity. Race was produced in the mapping of modern global and social spaces," unquote. So it's within this post-war, Cold War context that the new academic field, American Studies, was established as a disciplinary area study. Though different than these other area studies, it institutionalized the study of America as a distinct national society culture in order to educate Americans to be citizens at home as the US became an imperial power and the leader of the free world. Mid-20th century American studies in the US university showcased a selected canon of authors who epitomized a distinctive American literature, culture, and history. American thinkers that included Benjamin Franklin, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, John Dewey, and others, whose work exemplified themes of the Puritan mind, the self-reliant individual, manifest destiny, and most of all, American exceptionalism, the claim that the US is an exceptional nation uniquely founded on modern liberal democratic principles of inclusion and not an empire like those of former European empires that colonized and subordinated others. A people born of the encounter with undeveloped nature, with a spiritual mission chosen to redeem itself and to welcome immigrants and serve as an example for others. American exceptionalism, of course, predates this institutionalization of American studies in notable figures like Thomas Jefferson, Alexis de Tocqueville, and others. American exceptionalism rested in its institutionalized form in American studies, rested on the metaphor of two worlds in its mid-century historiography. Charles Beard wrote of settlers leaving the declining old world of Europe for the innocent new world of America, reiterating the Puritan narrative of a chosen people given the task of settling God's new kingdom on earth. Mid-20th century American historians returned to Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis about the creation of a new race born in the crucible of westward expansion to conquer the wilderness. American studies was founded with the notion of the American mind, a temper, a national character. The frontier was settled by the new Adam in the garden of the wilderness. The Cold War period also demanded a national culture defensively constructed against both foreign threats and internal influences, internally exercised in the affirmation of gendered notions of the middle-class family and consumer culture, concerned to contain and discipline the working classes, leftist politics, mass culture, kitsch, people of color, LGBT people, though they weren't called that at the time, criminality, and so forth. In this period, the Cold War was fought out as much on the cultural as the diplomatic front in the university, in area studies, and in American studies programs. It wouldn't be until the early 1990s that American studies scholars such as Amy Kaplan would criticize American exceptionalism and famously observe the absence of US empire in American studies. American exceptionalism famously selects Anglo-Protestants as the privileged subject people of historical progress, excluding Native and Indigenous people by erasing them or conflating them with the land and subsuming Blacks, Catholics, Jews, and other immigrants as people without history. Yet, as many Black, Native, and immigrant scholars have observed, the idea of American freedom didn't emerge in a vacuum. For example, in his monumental 1935 work, Black Reconstruction in America, W.E.B. Du Bois famously argued that slavery wasn't an aberration of American democracy, but in fact, its founding premise, its central contradiction. Toni Morrison in Playing in the Dark writes, quote, "Nothing highlighted freedom if it did not in fact create it, like slavery," unquote. That is, slavery forms the very conditions of possibility for the narrative imagination and manifestation of freedom, innocence, mobility, interiority in American literature, history, and public culture. Native and Indigenous historians like Jean O'Brien, Nick Estes, and others have likewise countered narratives of innocent pilgrims settling uninhabited lands, arguing that the narrative of the pilgrim in the uninhabited wilderness or the story of necessary war against Native people justified and made possible industrialization, expansion, and the prosperity of US modernity. But since the 1980s and 90s, American studies has undergone profound changes, and since that time has developed a strong critique of American exceptionalism. The field now includes particularly histories that have been disavowed by that exceptionalism, the settler dispossession of Native peoples and their continued survival, the enslavement of captive Africans, Jim Crow segregation, and African-American struggles today, the stolen labors of indentured and immigrant workers, and the losses of life as the US waged wars against Mexico, Germany, and Japan, in the Philippines, the Pacific, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In the last 3 decades, the field has actively centered African-American and Black Atlantic studies, women's history, feminist and queer studies, ethnic studies, Native American studies, and anti-colonial work, focusing especially on the construction of whiteness through the obscuring of Black and Native histories, as well as studying the US-Mexico borderlands, the US presence in the indigenous Pacific Islands, and so forth. Scholars have also respatialized American studies with various transnational perspectives, placing the US in hemispheric, transatlantic, archipelagic, transpacific, and transpacific frameworks that decenter the object of the US. It has also developed cultural studies, sound studies, and studies of visual culture and media. The social context for these changes in the field was the social movements of the 1970s, from the anti-war movement against the US war in Vietnam to Black Power and Third World movements to the women's movement. And these movements also included demands to restructure the traditional university, resulting in interdisciplinary fields like ethnic studies, African American studies, women's gender and sexuality studies. The post-war movements for decolonization in the 1950s through 70s also, as well as increased transnational migration and globalization in the 1980s onward, have contributed to this paradigm shift. So today, American studies not only dethrones the object, the United States, and American exceptionalism, but it's less exclusively focused on the object of the United States and emphasizes instead interdisciplinary research on US and the world, often drawing from several disciplines or including a sustained critique like the one that Dr. Kuchirko just gave us of existing disciplines, an imminent critique of knowledge that was established by these disciplines, whether history, English, anthropology, political science, etc., attempting to study new objects and create new methods. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lowe. We now move on to Professor Rhea Rahman, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Brooklyn College.
Thank you so much. Also, what I'm about to say that definitely has deep resonances with everything Professor Kuchirko and Lowe have shared already. I'm starting with maybe the not so secret history of the discipline of anthropology. It's a bit harder to claim that it doesn't have origins in colonialism in particular. So many have asked or have put forward, is anthropology the handmaiden of colonialism, with obvious origins in the 19th century at the height of British Empire. I often share this photo with students in my anthropology classes to engage a conversation about power and ideas of studying up and studying down. And I also start my course by reading this piece called The Nasarema, which maybe some of you have heard of it. A lot of people use it in intro to anthropology courses. And basically it's a satirical piece. Nasarema is American spelled backwards, but it's written in this kind of satirical language about this exotic people that, they go to these buildings where they are often sick and a lot of them die, but they still kind of trust it and they go there anyway. And they're talking about hospitals or they use these things. And so when students first read it, they're kind of horrified at these strange people and women that stick their heads in ovens and then they find out it's a hairdryer. And part of and it's supposed to do this, making the familiar strange and strange familiar, but also I often ask them, do you respect the Nasarema before you found out that they were American? Do you think of them as existing at the same, are they worthy? Are they human beings to you? As a way to kind of flip, why do we write about anyone like this in this language of the primitive and the othering? Origins, I mean, and so this debate about anthropology, I don't know if I'm dating myself with this meme, but kind of, I know this is used for every kind of theoretical debate, but very popular one in anthropology. Can it come out of its Orientalist origins, right? So is it always only an Orientalist endeavor? And anthropologists like John Jackson, who says, no, there's actually still valuable information to be gleaned from these classic ethnographic encounters, and others like Tuck and Yang and Kuthar that says, right, decolonization without changes in material conditions is liberal politics serving only the colonizer. So the debate continues within anthropology, and I'm going to go in a little bit more about what that's looked like within the discipline. So origins, though, beginning in the 19th century in Great Britain, obviously at the height of British Empire, and at the time, some classic texts like Primitive Culture, Primitive Marriage, and Ancient Laws. You can notice a theme about the ways that anthropology has always kind of created this both temporal and geographical other. Anthropologist Johann Fabian has kind of critiqued this idea of the denial of coevalness within anthropology. In order to maintain a type of objectivity and means to produce knowledge, the anthropologist must maintain a distance between the subject and object, and this happens through the temporal denial of coevalness. But also that the claiming to make sense of contemporary society in terms of this evolutionary stage, understanding those pieces like primitive society and ancient law as actually a means to justify colonialism, that these others who are not yet, as Professor Lowe was talking about within modernization theory as well. American anthropology as well, whereas British anthropology and French anthropology were very much contingent on the material conditions of colonialism. Those were also the spaces that those anthropologists had access to do field work. American anthropology, its origins, based very largely on what gets called salvage anthropology, the documentation of indigenous cultures considered to be dying or distinct. In 1992, Randall McGuire noted American archaeologists in particular were more interested in studying dead Indians than working with live ones. So the idea of preserving this culture without any analysis of the power dynamics of why supposedly these cultures are dying and disappearing in the first place in terms of American genocide and settler colonialism, which obviously within the discipline has been taken up. And in particular, Patrick Wolf's articulation of settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, and all of the changes that not necessarily that Wolf initiates, but a decolonized methodology and anthropology and centering the epistemological foundations upon which anthropological knowledge is produced. So scholars like Patrick Wolf and Audra Simpson and Glenn Seth Coutard have kind of made this critique and perhaps give us another foundational history to the discipline that I think is also important to consider, because I often, for myself, as identifying as an anti-colonial, anti-racist and feminist aspiring anthropologist, I would often ask my students, so why do you think I'm still an anthropologist, given all of this background that I'm telling you? And I'll get into a little bit more detail about that. But and also, I was charged with the idea of recentering the origins in the canon. Zora Neale Hurston was a student of Franz Boas, who I'll speak about later. And what would it look like? I mean, I'm more interested in perhaps questioning or dismantling the idea of a canon in the first place, but charged with the idea that anthropology from its origins also has this radical tradition. What would it mean to begin teaching anthropology from these other voices? So to think of Zora Neale Hurston's work as canonical in terms of producing anthropological knowledge. So another a thinker foundational for the development of my own critique of anthropology, Haitian anthropologist Michel Roth-Triot, who says of all academic disciplines, right, they don't create their fields of significance, they only legitimize particular organizations of meaning. They filter and rank, and in that sense, truly discipline contested arguments and themes that often precede them. So part of his critique in another piece that I teach in my intro classes is Anthropology in the Savage Slot, in which he flips it. So noting all of the ink that has been spilled over anthropology as a colonial discipline or not, on the one hand, there's sort of an easy critique of the material conditions of colonialism that allowed the production of knowledge, but actually Triot's critique goes deeper than that in terms of the epistemological foundations, the grounds on which we can even produce knowledge itself. So whereas it's less of a critique of anthropology, but more of a critique or an understanding of the world that anthropology makes possible. So in terms of that critical analysis, turning it on to, so anthropologists need to turn the apparatus elaborated in the observation of non-Western societies on itself, or more specifically, the history it comes from, which isn't the beginning of the discipline, but the symbolic field that makes this formalization possible. So in terms of redeeming anthropology, at the very least, anthropologists can show that the other here and elsewhere is indeed a product, symbolic and material, of the same process that created the West. And an idea that, that he develops in this piece is the West as a product, or anthropology as a product of the geographical imagination of the West, that this foundational assumption of the places from which knowledge can be produced and the places on which knowledge can be produced on, not as a source of knowledge itself. So we can make these critiques, but until we get at that foundational critique of how the modern world understands and produces knowledge in the first place, we only continue to reproduce the savage slot. Which gets me to what I've in particular, so race and the culture of anthropology. So if anthropology is a study of culture, why the need to create cultural studies, ethnic studies, and multiculturalism in particular, right? What happens with that? So Franz Boas, considered the anti-racist hero of anthropology. Boas was a Jewish German-American anthropologist, considered the father, and we can have a discussion about critiquing and killing the father in the first place, but the father of American anthropology, and is largely accredited with moving anthropology away from then prevalent ideas of scientific racism, the idea of race as biologically determined, and given by Boas's own particular experiences as a Jewish American academic at a height of anti-Semitism with the American Academy, was very much committed to undermining this idea of scientific racism. However, as a number of scholars have pointed out, in his critique of the biological conception of race, ultimately he reproduces in a focus on culture. Instead, a number of anthropologists have showed that culture ultimately ends up reproducing the same hierarchy. So instead of these racial hierarchies, the same hierarchies get reproduced in terms of cultural distinction. So Boas is also accredited with the idea of cultural relativism, in a way to say we can't necessarily judge cultures as less evolved or not, but that's ultimately what ends up happening despite his critique. So a number of scholars have made this critique within anthropology. What this separation does is it doesn't allow this focus now on culture and ethnicity in particular. It doesn't allow anthropologists to see or study race, and therefore, very importantly, to see or study racism, right? And to understand that race is a product of racism coming out of transhistorical processes of colonialism and slavery. So, however, given this inability to see race continues to be one of the most prevalent forms of social distinction and discrimination, and it continues to ground material reality. In response to another foundational anthropologist, Alan Herskovits, who's considered one of the fathers of Africanist anthropology, who claimed to W.E. Du Bois that there is no race of the American Negro, Du Bois retorts, quote, "I recognize it as quite easily and with full legal sanction. The Black man is a person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia." So in terms of this inability to see race doesn't allow to see these foundational social hierarchies that very much condition social reality. So I often say to my students, if anthropology is the study of humanity, how much unlearning do we have to do to actually recognize the humanity of others? So in many ways, that is what I'm aiming to do in my anthropology classes, is to take all of these social constructs that put all human beings into these hierarchies, and often ways that culture gets talked about as a way of evacuating the analysis of power that goes into the ways that human difference are often seen and thought about. Leith Mullings, another anthropologist who's made this critique that as anthropologists focus on ethnicity, and this for me is an anthropologist studying I don't want to say Africa, right? Because I am very much trying to think about identities as global, and the ways in particular I focus on global logics of racialization and the ways that they formulate people in very locally particular ways, but that white supremacy as a global logic has local manifestations in different places, but that the global structure itself needs to be taken into consideration as a kind of background foundation, trying to get at Trio's critique of the geography of imagination of the West. So in particular, right, as anthropologists focus on ethnicity, and this particularly happens amongst Africanist anthropologists, rather than analyzing how categories of race emerge and persist, racism continues to be under-theorized in anthropology. Again, not to say that it's not, because all of the anthropologists that I read and I'm interested in are very much centering that critique, and that's ultimately what I am trying to give to my students in my anthropology courses, and why I explain to them why, despite this origin, I am still an anthropologist, because I believe in particular the methodology of ethnography itself, it does have the radical potential to undermine and actually allow us to see the humanity of others. Right, and in terms of how I talk about ethnography as how can we shift that from a Malinowskian producing knowledge on, as opposed to considering what it means to produce knowledge with. So I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on now to Professor Christopher Richards, who's an assistant professor of art at Brooklyn College.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and being mindful of time, I'm just going to really jump right into my discussion. So although I'm an art historian, my specific field of research is African art history. So I will specifically be addressing the linkages between colonialism and the development of the field of African art, which are both direct and particularly strong. So I think it's important to begin acknowledging that the field of African art history is relatively new. The first American to be awarded a PhD in African art history was in 1957. So much of the information that I'll be presenting and sharing with you this evening is more interdisciplinary, as the individuals who collected and wrote about African art during the late 19th and early 20th centuries were often ethnographers, anthropologists, curators, and even missionaries. And as I will briefly share with all of you this evening, much of the artwork that is now celebrated in European American museums that is from the African continent was acquired as a byproduct of colonization and empire building. So I wanted to share with you two examples. One is a very well-known example of African art being stolen and then disseminated through Europe and America. And then the second is a lesser known example, but equally potent example of the seizure of African material culture. So on the left, you see a photograph from the punitive expedition of 1897, which is more accurately referred to as the Benin Massacre or the British invasion. So I won't go into extensive details, and probably many of you are familiar with this already, but for the purposes of this presentation, I want you to know that the Benin Massacre occurred between February 10th and February 18th of 1897, and it involved a group of British armed forces who were sent to Benin City, the capital of the Benin Empire, and they looted and burned the city, and they extracted a wide array of material culture that was expertly crafted and incredibly detailed. And I'm showing you this photograph because it actually attests to how these material objects were initially described. So when they came back to England, they were described in popular media as the spoils of war or war booty, right? And you can see how the men were actually treating them. Here are these incredibly artistic and technically advanced objects, but they were treated as spoils of war. So what is particularly interesting is within 2 months, early curators in England and Germany began to define these objects as art. And the reason why they do that is because the curators were acknowledging that they had a high level of artistry and technical mastery. And those elements of evaluation are still an integral part of assessing and analyzing African art today. And I think what's even more fascinating about this moment in time is that early curators were arguing that Africans could not have created these art forms, that they had to have been influenced by outsiders, they had to have been trained by someone else. But then as early as 1900, you have curators, particularly in Germany, who are arguing that these works were absolutely the creation solely of Africans, and that it was based on knowledge, inherited knowledge and skills, and so that it was a completely localized production. So in my opinion, what happens is that there's this tension that develops during the colonial era It's a desire to subjugate and other African people while simultaneously acknowledging and celebrating African artistry and creativity, albeit from this very restrictive lens of technical ability and aesthetics. And so then in tandem with these artworks that were seized on the left is this textile, which also has ties to British colonialism. So it's an Adinkra cloth that was worn by the Asantehene Prempeh I on the occasion of when he was exiled from Ghana. And there's a lot that could be discussed about this textile, but what I will say is that Adinkra cloths are worn on the occasion of funerals, and they are thought to symbolize the giving someone a farewell. And so this becomes a very powerful textile because the fact that the Asantehene wore this on the day of his exile suggests that he was literally and metaphorically bidding farewell to not only his people, but to his homeland. And so although this textile did not enter into a museum collection immediately following his exile, it was acquired by a private British citizen, and then it was acquired by a museum in 1983. But I wanted to share this with you because it just shows you the breadth of artworks and material culture that were taken from Africans as part of the active subjugation and colonization of African peoples. And so similarly to the Benin artworks, this textile was likely appreciated for its artistry and technical virtuosity, and yet it also functioned as evidence for the subjugation and literal stripping of African peoples of their cultural materials. So these are two very different examples that attest to the colonialist roots of the field of African art history. And so once these regions were colonized, there then was initiated another wave of collecting that often happened through research expeditions that were sponsored by museums. And I'm just going to give you two examples of those. So on the left, we have a photograph of Marcel Griol, who is a pretty well-known and influential early French ethnographer who actively collected African art and contributed to how the field values specific forms of African artistic expression over others. So beginning in 1933, he traveled to what is now present-day Mali, and he was collecting on behalf of the Trocadero Museum. And although he was instructed to collect a wide variety of material culture, he and his team privileged artworks or material culture that was associated with spirituality and what they deemed as rituals. And so what ended up is that he really collected a majority of masks and sculptures. And so when you look at the field of African art history, you see that this impacted the way that we look at African art, because historically forms of African material culture like masks and sculptures were often privileged over other artistic forms. And then the second image is of a Mangbetu pot, which I think is really interesting because it points to a development that occurred during this time of expeditions and active collecting. And that is the introduction of artwork that was specifically created for foreigners. So for decades, these anthropomorphic vessels were considered to be icons of Mangbetu art. They were considered to be these classic forms of Mangbetu expression. But what we now know is that they were actually created because the Europeans who were going on these expeditions, Europeans and Americans, the men were fascinated with Mangbetu women's bodies and how the bodies were adorned and decorated. And so because Mangbetu artisans acknowledged this and recognized this bias, right, they started creating these vessels that incorporated Mangbetu women's bodies and their decorations and adornments. And so we know that prior to the arrival of these expeditions, these vessels were not made. And then when the expeditions began to dwindle, so did the production of these vessels. So I think it's really interesting to think about how these expeditions impacted artistic production on the African continent. And then I will just end with one last example, and this is something that I recently learned about this summer. And this also just points to the role of artists in terms of representing African art and culture. And I think it's important that we acknowledge their role as well. So these are two kits that were designed in the early 1900s. And as far as I understand, they were designed to be portable so that artists who went on these expeditions were able to take these with them. And as you can see, one is a hair color scale and another is a skin color scale. And the idea is twofold. So artists would go to different places around the world and they would use these to both construct the race of the people that they were depicting, but then also more accurately represent those perceived racial distinctions in their artwork. And so I just wanted to share those with you because it was very disturbing to see these. I hadn't seen them before. but it also speaks to that idea of the construction of race that happens during colonialism and how all of these actions are really intertwined. And so in keeping with the time frame, I will stop with that. But if there are any questions, I can certainly add more to my discussion.
Thank you so much. Our final speaker is having a little bit of internet trouble. So I just want to see if Professor Suarez is here under a different name. If so, you can unmute and say hello. Otherwise, she might be back and able to speak to us about physics. And if not, or while we wait for her to potentially return, why don't we open up the floor for questions and conversation? We had some incredibly rich presentations from everybody that were just astounding. And this panel has made me incredibly happy to be a part of a university because it's so amazing just to see all these different angles at this one question and all these different things you can learn about at Brooklyn College. It's so cool. So please raise your hand. You can press the reactions button and the raise hand button to raise your hand to ask a question, pop in some ideas in the chat, write just to me, write to everyone, direct a question at a particular professor, make a connection between something a professor said in a class that you are in or that you have taken, make a connection between something that's been said here and something that was said earlier this week. Lots of connections happening here. Yes, Enrique.
Hi. Thank you so much. These great presentations. I really enjoyed all of them. My question is for Professor Kuchirko. And, what you said really resonated with me because I've been thinking about some of the same issues teaching a biostatistics course in health and nutrition science, where, we use a lot of similar statistics that you do in psychology, and came across the history of some of the great biostatisticians who developed statistics and even developed fields that we use, like biometrics. It turned out, if you look at their history, it's pretty ugly, and it's it seems like a lot of the motivation was to prove white supremacy or to justify quantitatively colonialism and eugenics. And I was just wondering how your colleagues or other people in your discipline might feel about these ideas or this reassessment, thinking about, what my colleagues, might think about it as well. Thanks.
Thank you for this excellent question. Absolutely. It's really kind of disturbing because every time I conduct statistical analyses and I have to write about Pearson's correlations, I'm citing a eugenicist, and it's so alive in every single paper. And so, there is movement. There's a whole kind of subdiscipline of like critical statistics where people are trying to reimagine and use statistics to actually promote the social good and to address inequities and racism in society. And, it's done in a lot of ways because statistics itself, you kind of gather, right, information and then run analyses, but how it's used is what's deeply troubling and problematic. And so there's definitely concerted effort to do that in terms of research. I've actually spoken to a fellow colleague at Brooklyn College today, and we were talking about, he was teaching statistics and talking about how even the teaching of statistics, how we can use examples and to show students that there are other ways to use numbers to actually for liberation rather than oppression. So there's absolutely effort. I hope that someone at some point changes these names of analyses because t-tests are eugenicists, like everything's linked to a former eugenicist, which is, but absolutely there's progress. It's slow, but there's absolutely progress. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
If no one else has a question quite yet, I know you're all typing furiously your questions into the chat. And while we wait, Professor Alterman, go for it. Can you unmute and ask?
Okay, now I am.
Excellent.
Sorry that I'm not showing my picture. I'm in my bathrobe because I got a booster shot last night and it's been killing me, and I can't get up off the couch. But I do have my class here, and it's a literature and film class. And something Professor Lowe said inspired a thought. I don't know if it's a question, but you mentioned Amy Kaplan, the late Amy Kaplan. And I'm writing a book on the history of the Israel-Palestine discourse in the United States. And I found her book enormously useful. I think it was called Our American Israel, the last book she published. And I wonder, since my class that I teach, it's in the English department, but I'm a historian, so it's kind of an American studies class. I wonder if you could speak to the value of literature and history as opposed to just straightforward history and just straightforward literature, because I thought that book to me illustrated the richness of that particularly.
Thank you for that wonderful question. Amy Kaplan was a tremendous scholar and actually a very close friend of mine, and former president of the American Studies Association. And her work really exemplifies exactly the virtues that you're pointing to, which is considering history, but with the care of textual analysis that one would get from literary studies. And I think she also, was ahead of her time in terms of, as I mentioned, bringing American studies to reckon with US empire, and then as an American Jew, really trying to put the situation of the US support of Israel and the colonization of Palestine on the table. And it was a terrible loss that she passed away. I was just going to make a comment if there are no questions. I loved the papers, and I loved the ways in which there were so many resonances between our different works. And I was just going to suggest that methodologically, Yana Kuchirko's paper and mine seem to really connect in relation to the hazards of normative concepts and the ways in which universalizing normative concepts can be used to reproduce racial hierarchies. And Rhea Rahman and Christopher Richards' paper were so eloquent about how colonialism extracts colonized countries and peoples in order to create their objects of analysis, for art history or for anthropology. At the same time, Professor Rahman was suggesting that there are ways in which anthropological study can be both critiqued but also used and remade. And I wanted to ask a question of Christopher Richards, if you think that there are ways to work within the field of history of art that doesn't extract and commodify and fetishize African objects, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've been thinking a lot about that Adinkra textile that I shared with everyone tonight. And I think that's a good example of a piece that really should be repatriated to Ghana. So what people might not know or fully understand is that, the Asantehene, there is an Asantehene in Ghana now. He rules over the Ashanti people. And he has an entire storeroom of historical textiles. And so this Adinkra cloth is so powerful, right? So I studied dress and textiles. So if you think about the energy and the emotions that are embedded in that textile, that is really something that should go back, because then it can be used by the current Asantehene. So I think, there's a lot of discussion about how do we not only give artwork back, but how do we also have conversations about what I was just saying? We need to be more transparent about how did we get these artworks? How did that original person acquire that? And so there was a really interesting exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum maybe 2 years ago, where the curator at the time looked at one costume that was from the Yoruba people in Nigeria, and she was able to trace it back to its origins and to the person who made it, and she interviewed the family and had permission from the family to keep the costume in the museum. But I mean, I think there's a lot more room for collaboration and really being very forthright with how these materials are in the museum, and then also getting permission from communities to decide whether or not we keep them, and be very willing to give them back, and then also to change the narrative around how we talk about them and exhibit them.
Yes, right on. We have another great question in the chat. Thank you for these presentations. Curious to know if anyone can share specific ways you practice decolonial and resist these exploitative, colonial, oppressive, insert word here, origins of your disciplines. Any concrete everyday examples you can share? So this builds a little bit on Professor Lowe's question, builds on how Professor Rahman ended her presentation. But if anyone wants to jump in with more everyday examples that you might have.
I could say a few things in the way that I try to, I'm teaching a course on ethnography right now, and using examples. So within students' development of their projects, I'm attempting to teach it through a lens of feminist ethnography and really foregrounding the question of ethical engagement with others. And in my intro classes, there's an attempt to kind of deconstruct the ways we think about human difference in ways that, as opposed to thinking about difference in ways that justify structures of hierarchy, to really think about how might we think about difference with an eye towards liberation. In terms of an everyday example is even just beginning today. We watched a film on race and pushing back against the idea of it as a biological concept in the ways that it continues to come up, even if students say, well, yeah, it's not biological, but Black people are still better at basketball. And like to think through the consequences of that, and to say, well, there are differences between genetic history or ancestry as opposed to race, because how can you say that if who is considered Black in Australia is not the same as who is considered Black in Brazil or in the United States or in Cuba? So that's a little bit in kind of intro of thinking about those concepts. And then in terms of students' own ethnographies, to really think of these people that you're spending time with are giving you their time and their knowledge. One, they are the experts. So how do you engage with them as you are not producing knowledge on them, but that what are you also offering them in return? What are you giving them? How will the work that you produce benefit these people in any way? So really, at the very least, and it doesn't undo that power dynamic, and it doesn't, but at least to get students to begin with those questions at the very beginning of their research, their own research engagements, or some of the everyday ways.
Anybody else want to speak to this? Yana?
I guess I could jump in. There are a couple of things I'm still learning how to unlearn the things that I've learned. But one thing that we do in lab is accountability letters. And this is something I've learned from my dear colleague, Arganiwa, who might be here somewhere. We have all of our students have students write accountability letters. And this is something that, I sit down and think about as well. To whom is my work accountable, right? How is my work? How am I doing it responsibly? In all of the undergrads and masters and doc students write positionality statements. It's actually something I do in all of my classes as well, to really get people to think about their own, right, all the cultural baggage they bring with them, all of who their histories are brought into the research context, into the classroom. So we do a bunch of that. And then something that we try as much as possible is to really question the taken for granted assumptions and constructs that are popular in our discipline, and try to see where they come from, and sort of really embed it, not just in culture, but then how is that culture part of the larger historical process, and how is that, part of colonialism? And a lot of my students are interested in, how identity could be, is colonial identities and mentalities, and so not divorcing psychological phenomena from all of these power structures, and just talking about this stuff a lot in class, in labs, just trying to get the toolkit, right, to practice talking about this all the time, to understand, to deepen knowledge, and to be humble, and in terms of knowing that, there's always more to learn, and that we can make mistakes, and we'll just, yeah. So this is some practical examples of what I've been trying in my work.
If anybody else wants to speak, feel free to. Chris, go for it.
I can just share a brief story. So just to let everyone know, I research on fashion and dress, particularly in Ghana and South Africa. And so I had this encounter where a woman said to me, my mother was a fashion designer, and I was really intrigued. And she told me all this information about her mother. But then I realized that I was doubting her because I had been trained by the academy to try and find actual documentation that would support this woman's claims, right? And so I had this moment where I said, why am I doing that? And so in the book that I just finished, I talk about that, and I say that as someone who studies African culture and history, that I have to really begin to champion African voices. And then it doesn't have to always be about me finding a newspaper article or a resource that validates what someone is saying, that it is enough to have someone say, this was my family. And it just so happened that there were documentation, right, that supported what she was saying. But I mean, this idea that we do have to start reconsidering how we look at people's cultures, and that if we're going to do this kind of research, that it's important to really celebrate and champion the African voice, right? And to say that it's okay if most of this chapter is just from oral history, because that is how much of African history was recorded. So I think that is a way that I've tried to kind of push back and say, I'm not going to completely try and validate what I'm writing about through what the academy says, and that it's okay to have another viewpoint and another perspective on it. So that's just one example from my own research.
Great. Jihad Hassan, I saw you put your hand up and then you took it down, but I'm going to encourage you to ask your question. I hope I didn't interrupt you by asking the one from the chat. Do you want to ask your question? Putting you on the spot. This is just an open invitation. Oh, it was not a question? Oh, okay. If you have a comment and you wanted to make it and you want to put it in the chat, that's cool too. Go for it. There are also there's a question from Kanadia Lucian in the chat. I don't know if there will be much to add from what you already presented, but to Professor Lowe, could you mention that these area studies were established after 1945. Could you talk more about the role the government played in funding these area studies, and what kind of effect did this education effort have outside of the US before the social movements in the 1980s and 1990s?
Thank you for the question. If I understand correctly, I feel like the question is about let me put it this way. I think after 1945, the US state was involved in investing in a variety of ways in the formerly colonized world and the decolonizing world. That included creating area studies in the US to create experts on Africa, on East Asia, on Southeast Asia, and so forth, Latin America. But it also involved the development of the World Bank and the IMF, and investing in economic development, creating, later in the 80s, structural adjustment programs. It involved setting up military bases. So it was a very multi-pronged set of investments, one piece of which was developing area studies and US experts in the United States. If I understand, the question is sort of aimed at, did these programs also help or develop the decolonizing world? And I think that's how they were framed, is developing various countries. the role government played in funding the area studies and what, oh, did this have outside, maybe they could say a little bit more about what's behind the question. I don't understand the relationship to the social movements in the US.
Nadia, I know you can do it. Unmute, you can do it. You want to talk? Maybe she'll put.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the social movements was like when they started to like decenter the US as like an object. So
Yes.
I was just wondering, like, before it got to that point, like obviously those programs were successful in like creating like helping to contribute to like a global hierarchy. I was just wondering, like, outside of like the US, like those people who were initially learning under those programs, what kind of, if like you had any idea of like what kind of effect they had in like the area, like if they were learning in an area study for like Russia or Japan, like if that had any effect, like what kind of effect did that have outside of the US, if that's clearer?
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. The area studies programs that I'm talking about actually were in American universities. But there was an expansion of university systems around the world in the post-war period. And another, I mean, you anticipated something I didn't even say, which is that there also developed a kind of global American studies set of programs where you would have American studies in South Korea, American studies at the American University of Beirut. There are lots of different American studies at the JFK Institute in Berlin, for example, as a kind of set of ambassadorial programs, introducing the rest of the world to the literature, history, and culture of America. So I think those are the kinds of programs to which you might be referring, which were not really connected. The social movements of the 1980s and 90s in the US, I think, had to do with anti-racist, anti-war, equity movements in housing, education, workplace, and so forth in the US, rather than this US development program elsewhere, if that makes sense. Thank you for your question.
Amai.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'm posing this question to everyone. However, it did develop while Professor Richards was detailing the issue raised with members of African society being doubted for the artwork they created. My question is, should art be valued less if it is influenced by another culture? And can one truly create an entirely uninfluenced work?
I guess that's kind of directed at me, so I should answer that. So one of the things that I always like teaching my students in class is that African art does not exist in a bubble, right? And so when you look at African art, it's been influenced for centuries from all over the world because the African continent was inherently global and always has been. So I mean, I think it's really powerful to acknowledge that because it says that Africans were completely interconnected with the globe. And so I think, I mean, I can just think of, my mind is sort of racing, but there's so many examples in which you see artworks that would be classified, well, that were made on the African continent, but that were certainly taking ideas and inspirations from other cultures. But I think that's something that's occurred across the globe. And I'm sure other people can speak to that. But I think it's really hard to say is something a purely one culture without influence. I don't know what other people would think about that, but that's just my initial reaction to the question.
Anybody else want to speak to that? Jacques.
Hi, I actually have a question both for Professor Rahman and Professor Richards. How would you determine the connection between cultural appropriation in the colonialist era in Africa being indicative of the racist anthropological perception from the subjugators?
Can you say what you mean by the cultural appropriation?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'm curious as to, how was the racist anthropological perception propelled by the cultural appropriation in the colonialist era? I have a feeling that it was, raised, and it was probably, I guess, it made a cultural appropriation gave like a good reason to bash on or hype on the racist anthropological perceptions at that time. I was hoping if you could expand as to if there was a connection in that time, or perhaps I'm just being too specific, and I apologize.
Maybe an example of cultural appropriation? Like, do you mean like the stealing of art that Professor
Yes.
Richards was talking about? Okay.
So just so we can clarify, so can you just say that again, but just rephrase it? Because so where I'm getting caught up is that I teach cultural appropriation, but that has a contemporary meaning. So what you're saying is the sort of the stealing and the acquiring of art objects. You're asking, did that contribute to racism? Can you just clarify that a little bit?
Yes, apologies. I guess I'm curious as to whether or not, like, culture appropriation gave racist anthropology sort of like a stronger and higher platform. Was it, were the colonialist cultures back then were emphasizing their power over, underdeveloped countries, and whether or not there was a strong connection towards these two different subjects. I apologize. This is a very roundabout subject. I don't mean to take up time.
Maybe by way of begin, I mean, I think the idea of African culture as distinct in the first place, part of that, what I was trying to get at is like the questioning of, when I talk about epistemal foundations, like how we know. So the idea that there is African culture in the first place, and what Professor Richards was talking about, like Africans, and I always put this in quotes because we have such an idea of Boaz's idea of like cultural relativity, that human beings are in these distinct cultural kind of bubbles, and there's Africans over there and America, that in itself is part of this way of thinking that is tied to the political historical events of transatlantic slavery and colonialism itself. So to think of African art as distinct in the first place is a part of that world making. So I guess when you're talking about the appropriation, like it is very much maybe like Edward Said's idea of like the Orient doesn't exist. It's a figment of the Western's imagination of what the Western in the creation of a concept of whiteness and white maleness, which ultimately becomes what it means to be human, right? It's the construction of everything and everyone that is not that. So that the other and African art and the Middle East and all of these other parts of the world are actually, the representations of it is actually a fantasy of the white Western subject. So I don't know if that gets it.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Like, I really appreciate that explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely correct. And, just to add on to that, this idea that African art was exhibited and discussed and analyzed because it was in many ways reifying those constructions of race and identity and colonialism, right? Because it was this idea that it kind of went back to always suggesting there was a difference there, that there was something, that there were Europeans in there and there were these other groups, right? And that's why what I think is so strange is that in many ways, there was this idea of celebrating the artistry, but yet whoever the artwork was produced by was always set at a difference. It was put at arm's length from Europeans, and it was used to distinguish between these groups and create them and reify them for sure.
Amai, do you have another question that I missed? Professor Alterman mentioned something in the chat.
Oh, Oh, no, I just had my hand raised up. Thank you, though.
Okay, okay, great. Great. Any other questions? There's some fantastic discussion that's happening in the chat if you want to just take a look and see what's going on. But it's 6:20. So I think before we thank our panelists, I just want to pitch what's happening tomorrow. So if you want to hear about colonialism that happens before 1492, it happens before 1492. Come learn about that tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. We'll have a panel of pre-modernists talking about colonialisms before the 15th century. And then we have a panel at 11 a.m. on the new nativism. And then we have at 5 o'clock, the event we've all been waiting for. Professor Lowe will give her Hess lecture on the colonial present. So we hope that we see you all there at one or all of the events tomorrow. And let's give a big round of applause to our fantastic panel of scholars and their fantastic thoughts, and a round of applause to all of you for your fantastic questions. So thank you all so much for being here, and we'll see you tomorrow.